Tonight marks the 17th year of the Stephen Murray Smith Lecture. Geoffrey Blainey is one of Australia's most significant, popular and sometimes controversial historians, highly regarded for the originality and breadth of his historical writing. He pioneered the field of business history in 1954 with The Peaks of Lyell, the story of Mount Lyell mining field in Western Tasmania, and it's appeared in 6 editions, the most recent in the year 2000. In all, Professor Blainey has written some 37 books, including such influential works as The Tyranny of Distance, Triumph of the Nomads, The Causes of War, A Short History of the 20th Century, and A Short History of the World. And his most recent is Sea of Dangers. Several titles have been translated and appear in many foreign language editions. And tonight readers feast to have a selection of his books for sale in the foyer at the back of you, and he'll be available, I'm assured, to sign copies for you after tonight's lecture. 2008 marks the 20th anniversary of the passing of Stephen Murray Smith. In his lecture tonight, Stephen's friend and colleague, Professor Blainey, will speak on the challenges and the changes he's experienced over more than 50 years in writing Australian history. And now to the lecture. Would you please make welcome Geoffrey Blainey.
John Cain, Murray Smith family, honoured guests. Thank you very much, John, for the generous introduction. I was thinking of the first time I met you. I was playing, I think, on the wing for the Wesley College under-15Bs. Or I may have even been A's, and I played against you on the wing at Scotch College. You were a great drop kick. I make that as a neutral comment. The practitioner of the drop kick is now so rare that you may well be put in a museum before you die. But thank you very much. The State Library suggested that I should speak on writing Australian history. I've had a long connection with the State Library. I remember, for some reason, I was very keen on Australian history when I was very young. And I think even at the age of 14, when I had the spare time and was free, I came into the newspaper room, which was very close then to the main entrance of the library, and would ask for a copy of the Argus of 1880 or the Age of 1875 and read them faithfully through. I had an absurd knowledge of Australian history by the time I was 18. At that time, some of you will remember, old men who wanted warmth in winter used to frequent the newspaper room. They'd ask for a newspaper, open it at a page, and then fall asleep on its pages. I remember once I had a beautiful scarf and I put it on my newspaper, and the next day I saw an old man wearing it very proudly. He wore it for years. It was an early form of socialism. I had a great desire when I was young to write. I didn't know what I wanted to write or what I could write, but writing gave me great pleasure. When I went to the university, I still had that desire without knowing what to do. And when I was offered the chance of becoming sporting editor of Farrago, I accepted it gladly. I had the good luck to be co-sporting editor with Lindsay Thompson, who I think, John, was your predecessor. He was a very nice man, and we looked after the sports page with great pleasure, rewarding those who deserved reward. Then I became the editor of Farrago, and there were 2 editors, Tony, Harold and I, and we took alternate editions. And if there wasn't many staff around, I had great pleasure in writing a large proportion of the Farrago, including the letters to the editor. In those days, you didn't have to sign letters to the editor. I did a history course in the Melbourne History School, which was a great place of education, and I still had this burning desire to write, and after the 3-year honours course, which was then normal, and I thought long enough, Professor Crawford, the Professor of History, said that the Mount Lyell Company on the west coast of Tasmania would be interested in somebody doing historical research. It so happened that Marnie Bassett, who that year or soon was to produce a book called The Hentys, which had a wide readership in Victoria, about that family which settled Portland in the 1830s, her husband was on the board of the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company, and they arranged through Professor Crawford for somebody young to come over and do some research. Right from the start I had in mind to write a book, although of course I didn't tell them. It was very strange. I got for 1 year £3 a week from the Melbourne University and £3 a week in expenses from the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company, which was a very big company in those days, with its own mine, smelter, refinery, hydroelectric station, railway to the coast, wharves and so forth. For some strange reason I had to meet the board. The board was in Collins House, 360 Collins Street, which was then, I suppose, the citadel of Australian capitalism. I wore my new suit, which I bought at the Leviathan, a dark suit with white stripe and a smart tie and a white shirt, and I went to meet the board at 9:30 on board day. It was really quite a remarkable experience because I went in and I was surely the lowest paid adult employee in the whole company, but there they were inspecting me. The chairman was Mr. Ken Niall, who was also chairman of Gulsborough and Mort, which was a great name in those days. Sir Henry Lawson, who'd been the Premier of Victoria from 1918 to 1924, was also on the board, and 3 or 4 other very interesting people. They treated me with great respect, and to my astonishment, they began to discuss amongst themselves when the company was founded. I thought directors of a company at least would know that. But eventually they turned to the secretary, whom they called Parsons. They said, "Parsons, when was the company founded?" And Parsons turned to me for support. I knew I was made. So I went to the west coast of Tasmania in the ship to Burnie, and then on the Imby Bay Railway to Zeehan, and then by bus to Mount Lyell. Many of you have been to the west coast of Tasmania. Mount Lyell was famous then because of its denuded landscape. It was famous in the history of the world's metallurgy. It's not widely realised even to this day. Ever since fire had been invented and tamed, the great dream of metallurgists, and indeed of ordinary smeltermen, was to smelt hard metalliferous rock without the aid of fuel. And in 1902, at Mount Lyell, for the first time in the history of the world, they smelted rock without the addition of any fuel except the sulphur that was in the ore. It was one of the great days in the history of world metallurgy. The general manager of Mount Lyell and the metallurgist, Robert Karl Sticht, a German name and American educated, he was a great collector. And in that isolated house on the hill at Queenstown, he had one of the great collections of printed books and of Dura woodcuts. And I think a large part of that collection came to the State Library of Victoria. I set to work there, and it was really so exciting. I was only 20 when I arrived, and some of the people who were high up in the company thought I was too young to be given access to the records, but eventually they relented. It was very interesting to find the old people because the place had been settled in the late 19th century and there were no newspapers in the district. It was very isolated. The prospectors came through carrying their own supplies and cutting their own tracks with an axe, carrying all their food on their backs, and there was very little report of their activities in any of the newspapers, even in Hobart and Launceston. But those simple men turned that region into one of the great mining regions of the world. There was an old man there. We knew nothing in those days about oral history, but there was an old man who lived on the balcony of a Hotel Bowers Hotel, and people said to me, "You must see Mr. Elliot." Eventually I found Mr. Elliot. He always wore an overcoat. He was very stooped. He was then in his mid-80s. He'd been born at Stiglitz, a goldfield between Ballarat and Geelong, in 1867, and they'd moved to Barry's Reef between Blackwood and Bacchus Marsh, and there he and his brother had a great ambition to make money. And Barry's Reef, a gold town, was declining, and many of the people were going to Mount Bischoff in Tasmania. And these two boys said, "We'll go there too." And they chopped down a big tree and sold the wood. And they got enough money to buy a train ticket to Melbourne, to stay in a hotel opposite the exhibition building, which was just being built, and then to catch the train to Burnie and then to walk 40 miles to Mount Bischoff. He told me all this. It was tremendously interesting because Mount Bischoff was the first big mine on the west coast and the predecessor to Zion and Mount Lyell and Rosebery and other big mines. It was very interesting in those days. There was no tape recorder, and like many old people, they didn't like you taking notes. Nowadays, if you go to interview somebody and you haven't got a tape recorder, they're equally disgusted. But I used to sit there and he would tell me the most interesting things because, like many men with little education, he had a remarkable memory. And when he'd finished talking, I would write down as fast as possible everything that he told me. I found the other day a copy of the Burnie Advocate for 1951, and surreptitiously I'd been writing on it little things that he told me. He didn't think I was taking notes. We became great friends, and he used to call each evening to the batch where I lived with tobacco and tally-ho papers, and I would roll him his quota of cigarettes for the next day. He was a wonderful source. I feel so sorry that there were no cheap tape recorders in those days, and I didn't record him because he had a most remarkable life as a prospector. His ambition, curiously, was to be a stockbroker, an ambition that was never realised. He had a very simple attitude to the world. He left Melbourne in 1879 and never saw it again. The last time he saw Hobart was in 1886. Some people had found rich gold and they thought they'd buy shares, and the nearest stock exchange was Hobart, and they set him, a very young man, to walk to Hobart to buy the shares. He always thought Hobart was a long time away. I remember I was away from Queenstown, Mount Lyell, for 4 days, and when I returned, he said, Jimmy, he always called me Jimmy. He said, Jimmy, it was his name. Jimmy, he said, where have you been? I said, I've been to Hobart. Hobart, he said, you certainly get around. So I was there on the West Coast for 3 years, I suppose really learning my trade, meeting so many people of all occupations and finding out so much about their lives. And eventually the company let me use their rich repository of records. If you're a company a long way from head office, there's great communications. The head office was Melbourne. The company, of course, was managed from Queenstown, and here were all these remarkable letters from the board to the general manager and back again. It was very difficult learning to write. Many of you here write, and it's a kind of an apprenticeship that, in a way, you can only teach yourself. In those days, I wrote by longhand, and I think I wrote 3 books before I eventually belatedly took to the typewriter. Of course, I ended up with the word processor. It's so lonely writing if you have nothing else to do, and eventually I learned to master the art of writing and to do some each day. I finally finished the book, and I showed it to the directors. They knew I was writing a book, and they said I could publish it. They didn't offer any money, but I went to the Melbourne University Press. Mr. James then was the manager of Melbourne University Press, and he read it, and to my delight, he said they would publish it. In those days, publishing was very slow. I think it took a year or 14 months from when I gave him the manuscript until when the book appeared. In those days, there were no book launchings, at least I didn't hear about them. And occasionally I used to go to the press and say, when is the book coming out? They said they weren't quite sure, but if I looked in the shops, eventually I'd see it. Great was my delight. Do you remember Robertson and Mullins in Elizabeth Street, down towards the Flinders Street station? And there, in the window, was a pile of this book called The Peaks of Lyell. A terrible thing happened. There was a disaster in 1912 at Mount Lyell, the worst mine disaster in Australian history in a metalliferous mine. It was like the events of Beaconsfield that we witnessed a year or so ago, magnified many times. It was a deep copper mine called the North Lyell mine. It was a day shift. They worked from 8 to 4, and then the afternoon shift came on. There were about 200 men in the morning shift, and when they were in the mine, a small fire started in the mine. It didn't spread very far, but it set in motion carbon monoxide fumes, and they spread. Large numbers of men were down in the mine for 5 days before finally they were rescued. it's very different to the typical mine disaster in Australia. You know, the two great mining disasters in Australia have been coal mines. Coal gas exploded and that was the end of it. There was no chance of rescuing anybody. But here with these 5 men down below, including my old friend Jimmy Elliott, down below for 5 days, wondering whether they would be rescued. There was some evidence that the mine was, at a time of acute industrial trouble, that the fire had been deliberately lit, not to kill men, but to show that the mine wasn't completely safe. And I wrote this up in my book. It was terrible when the book was about to come out. Somebody said to me, "What's happened to the man who allegedly lit the fire?" I said, "I don't know." And I went to the company and I said, "Do they know what happened to the man?" Because it was easy by oral evidence to work out who he was. And they sent a detective to various places in Australia, old mining fields, to find out if he was still alive. And they didn't find out anything. He may well still be alive. Of course not. So the book was published. It was very exciting for me. I had a great desire to write. I made a terrible mistake. Frank Eyre, who was then the manager of Oxford University Press, quite a large publisher based in Melbourne, he came to me after my first book was published and said, "Would you like to write a history of Australia?" They had published for many years, since the First World War, Ernest Scott's short history of Australia, which was a great seller in schools and was much read in libraries and sold a little in bookshops. He said, "It will sell well." I thought, what a great chance, but there was no way of gaining money in those days. There were no literary grants, and in the end I said to him, "No, I don't think I can do it." It was really stupid because I should have borrowed the money somehow and spent a year and a half and written it, and I threw away that great opportunity. Fortunately, and I'll just won't go very long on this section of my talk. Fortunately, there was a man named Peter Johns who was the director of Mount Lyell and also the chairman of Johns and Wakewood. Johns and Wakewood is gone now, but most of the lifts in Melbourne at one time were marked Johns and Wakewood. And indeed, the structural steel that was put on the big buildings in Collins Street and Burke Street was marked Johns and Wakewood. And Mr. Johns said to me, since I had nothing to do, "Would you like to write a little history of Johns and Wakewood?" It was started in 1856 by an English migrant who'd worked on the Crystal Palace in London and then migrated to Melbourne. He paid me well and I was so appreciative. I had some trouble with Johns and Wakewood, although it was tremendously interesting, the rise of this firm. The chairman of the firm about 40 years ago was a man named Alfred Johns. He was a very talented man and a great cricketer. He played cricket for Australia. I think he was a wicketkeeper. But in old age he was chairman of the company and his attitude to life was more leisurely. And people told me that he'd come into their office in the morning, do anything that needed doing, and then go to the Athenaeum Club where his special friend was the police commissioner, and they'd play cards till 3 o'clock. Then his chauffeur would take him back to the Johns and Wakewood head office and he would sign any letters and go home. I thought this was an interesting break for me, and I described this in great detail. I described how Alfred Johns, in the shadow of his life, had lost all interest in the business and didn't know the difference between a steeplejack and a steeple. Peter Johns read the manuscript. He was delighted because I told him so much about the history of their company and the interesting things that had happened. He said, "There's one problem." He said, "Old Mrs. Johns is still alive." Being young, I said, "Does that matter?" He said, "Yes, it does." He said, "There's this sentence here about him knowing nothing about the business in his old age. He would be really offended." She knew that he drank constantly with the police commissioner and didn't spend much time at work, but to say that he didn't know anything about the business would offend her deeply. I said, "What do you suggest?" He said, "I'll go away and think about it." He came back and showed me a sentence which said, "Mr. Johns had a capacity for delegation not shared by many modern leaders of business."